I'm Mark Sanders, professor of English and Africana Studies here at Notre Dame, and a colleague of our speaker, Professor Xavier Aquino. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the Ahead of the Game Football Season Lecture Series, sponsored by the College of Arts and Letters. Over the course of the season, we have heard from faculty members from all over the college on a wide range of topics, including video gamers as researchers and artifacts from Notre Dame's history hiding in plain sight. We hope to see many of you on November 15th when economist Casey Buckles will talk about the economics of baby booms and busts. Before introducing today's speaker, I'd like to thank our colleagues in the Department of Music and the Program of Sacred Music for welcoming us into their building and recital hall. I would also like to acknowledge Becky Badger, right there in the back, Senior Administrative Coordinator in the Dean's Office, who's worked with our speakers, the Communications Office, and many others to make this series happen. Our speaker today is Professor Xavier Navarro Aquino, Assistant Professor in the Department of English and Creative Writing. Professor Navarro Aquino's debut novel, Velorio, was published by HarperCollins this year in both English and Spanish editions to great acclaim. As you probably noted, we have copies of Velorio for sale here today, and Professor Aquino will be available to sign your copy after his presentation. As one reviewer wrote, quotes, Velorio is both a complex, politically engaged work and a deeply human story from a writer who's surely at the start of a long career, end quote. Professor Navarro Aquino's talk today, Professor Aquino's talk today, quote, of abandonment and a storm's wake, end quote, draws from themes he explores in Velorio. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Xavier Navarro Aquino.
Thank you, Mark, for that introduction, and thank you, Becky Badger, and everyone here that helps make these events possible, right? But more importantly, of course, thank you all the visitors that are here this afternoon. I must admit that when I first received the invitation to speak, I was a bit hesitant. Not because of the inherent work that goes into preparing one of these lectures, but because I found myself asking a critical question, one that is at the heart of many writers and scholars, and that is, what can I possibly say in 40 minutes that will resonate with an audience that has so many options when it comes to entertainment on the eve of a most sacred practice, which is, of course, college football Saturdays. Tomorrow, go Clemson and Notre Dame, right? This lecture series is cast as one that looks to vocalize all the exceptional research being conducted in the arts and letters. So I figured then that this lecture is nothing more than one story to tell. I was in graduate school in the year 2017. It was Lincoln, Nebraska, of all places. Those that know me understand this one thing. I'm not a fan of the Midwest. I don't want to offend anyone here, but I'm speaking as someone who was born and raised in the Caribbean, right? The whole beaches and summer season year-round thing, it's not that bad. So when winter is making its gestures here in South Bend, as it has been before this week, my relationship with this region gets a little complicated and sometimes damaged. Winter is certainly coming, though I always say winter is here when it's 40 degrees outside, so I don't know if you want to take me on that. But naturally, when I say I was in Lincoln, Nebraska, pursuing my PhD at the University of Nebraska, I'm saying this as someone that is or has come to terms with the idea that I am officially a Puerto Rican in the diaspora. This is important to understand for the context of this talk. The U.S. Census, according to the sociologist, historian, and scholar Cesar Ayala, states that as of 2018, Over 5.8 million Puerto Ricans live throughout the 50 states, compared to the declining population of the 3.2 million in the Puerto Rican archipelago. Data suggests that these numbers have continued to increase and decrease depending on the vantage point, right? Increase and decrease. Historically, the diversification of those leaving the island has also changed, where it is no longer predominantly working class individuals seeking opportunity and employment, but also young, educated, and degree-seeking individuals leaving home. The complications of this mass exodus seem pretty apparent. As part of the colonial construct is ultimately leaving the future of Puerto Rico into a speculation, one that suggests the colonial motto is to have a Puerto Rico absent of Puerto Ricans. In this talk, I won't be diving into the dated inquiry regarding political status. I kindly refer you to journalist Bianca Graulo's YouTube page, which is an accessible and powerful modern learning tool that should be viewed by many as a way to better understand the colonial relationship and violence the United States has historically enacted on Puerto Ricans and continues to do so. See here. What I want to focus on is this notion of speculating futures, the power of storytelling, and the critical role the year 2017 had on our people, or better put, on the 3.2 million US citizens and the over 5.8 million in the diaspora. There's a guilt that comes with leaving, right? This is especially true of Puerto Ricans in the 21st century. So we were born from the island, the salt on our skin, the humid air in our lungs, spoiled by nature and its beauty because it is true. Puerto Rico is beautiful, almost impossibly beautiful. So being away from home often serves as a reminder. And during the fall of 2017, while I and many others like me were in pursuit of opportunity, Hurricane Maria marked what I call the aftermath. The Caribbean region, as seen here, is situated as the epicenter of modernity, largely due to the transatlantic slave trade. I always point to what Trinidadian poet Shivani Ramlochan has said about our region, quote, "Reading the Caribbean means you read the world," end quote. A byproduct of the colonial enterprise is that of Puerto Rico, an island woven in the fabric of these spaces, indigenous, African, European, and American. The byproduct from all these occupancies can only be described as a current political double consciousness, or in more radical terms, a political schizophrenia. One where we are forced to consider not only our ethnic identities and histories, but that of political and national identities and their relationship to empire. It is in this psychosis that we situate ourselves in the collective, that of memory and recollection, remembrance and aftermath. The scholar and professor Eddie Glaude Jr. recently published a book called Begin Again, where he calls attention to our current American moment, that of Trumpism, the resurgence in nationalist rhetoric, white supremacy, and calls for global fascism. Through the study of James Baldwin, Glaude Jr. terms our current national climate as the after times. I won't elaborate on this point here, but I want to emphasize the argument that he is making through his research into James Baldwin. He argues that Baldwin's experiences abroad heightened his understanding of American racism and the responsibility Baldwin felt to participate in the civil rights movement in order to bear witness. Similarly, Puerto Rico's own economic and political construct is in line with its own after times. In my personal reflection, it is in my distant and my diaspora that I come to the term aftermath. For everything that encompasses the complexity of the colonial moment, race, racism, class structures, mobility, diaspora, culminated with the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. Puerto Rico is a performance of the incubation and affects of colonization, race, identity, and culture. So these global groupings, which are derived from one specific incident, right? I mentioned the transatlantic slave trade, offer post-colonial studies as a necessary vehicle to address race and racism in the United States and beyond, with particular emphasis toward the rootedness of anti-colonial efforts that fulfill, in essence, the true emancipatory legacy of the post-colonial, which returns me back to the fall of 2017. A few days before Hurricane Maria hit, I called my mom because I wanted to hear her voice. She did what all mothers do, told me not to worry, my brother was there, and they were ready for the hurricane. They were prepared. I didn't believe it. I kept refreshing the computer screen as I spoke to her and saw how big Maria got. Noticentro, one of the major news programs on the island, upgraded her to a Category 5. They said she would likely weaken to a 4, but I knew that once wind climbed that high, numbers and categories don't really matter. I refreshed and I refreshed the screen as my mom's soft and patient voice reminded me to relax, that things would be okay. I knew that she was repeating this for herself too. But I wanted more because I felt in my gut this storm would be different. The morning the hurricane was projected to make landfall, I woke up my wife at 3 a.m. and I scanned orbits for a flight back home. It was surreal to see plane tickets so cheap, $100, $150. We'd grown used to dropping an average of $800 each just to return to our island. Like many people that live in diaspora, there is always a high cost to leaving, in more ways than one. I tried this last attempt at distraction because scanning for those tickets on orbits wasn't enough, so I called my brother as I held my credit card like a passport. He was planning on riding out the hurricane with my mom. I told him I was about to buy tickets and head over, and his voice was still hoarse after waking from sleep. No, he repeated. We did not plan for you. We did not ration enough for 3 people. He walked to my mother's room and passed the phone to her. She again, with her calm voice, insisted that it would be okay. But this is different, I remember saying to her. Honey, it'll pass, we will be okay, she replied. My wife and I moved to Lincoln for grad school, which was my second return to the Midwest, my second leaving of home. We had gotten married that summer. I had just received the news of my first major publication, and I finally grew into my rhythm in teaching undergraduate students at Lincoln. Learning to be away from home mostly becomes about rhythms, right? The rhythm of distracting oneself until we have tired ourselves out of nostalgia. Then in turn, about sustaining that distraction until all you learn to know is distraction. Perhaps that's why I called her. I wanted to hear home at least one more time before things turned. Hear the voice of family to distract me from being so far away. The day of Maria felt tenuous as I experienced it from afar. Teaching my undergrads that day became my distraction. I remember my students were particularly difficult that afternoon. I tried introducing some work by the Nigerian writer Chris Abani, but in their polite Midwestern way, as some of you may be aware of this, they weren't participating. But I don't blame them. When I look back at it, I was unfocused on my lesson plan, and I spent the entire day tracking the flight that I would have boarded the eve of Maria's landfall. I tracked the flight and watched it become the only flight that was not canceled, how it landed just as the outer rain bands from Maria started grazing San Juan and Carolina. That flight landed, but I wasn't on that flight. The aftermath of such a terrible force is unimaginable. Here I had put a collage of 5 tiles of different excerpts of videos that either I took or my in-laws took, and they're supposed to be playing quietly in the background, but because they were made in a Mac computer, apparently Notre Dame is still unfriendly to Macs. So you can still view some of these, but in essence, they're supposed to be in movement in the background. So the landscape was consistently described as if an atomic bomb were dropped and the entire island died over a single day. The green, it was gone. The water, mud. Everything we did to control an environment was destroyed. And metal, concrete, electricity seemed so fragile that it could snap like a brittle twig. We lost connection to everyone back home. We called desperately and only heard answering machines. We left messages on all the social media platforms hoping to hear the familiarity of home, the voices of those that we left behind. Few days after she hit, the collective pain of a diaspora and grief billowed, and so many of us wondering what kind of home was left in her wake. So many voices, many would never hear again. I kept reminding myself what my mother told me that morning, that it'll pass, we will be okay. But some reassurances don't linger with you after they're said. After many attempts at booking a flight back to Puerto Rico, after hours on the phone with customer service hoping to reschedule canceled flights, I managed to book a ticket about a week after Maria made landfall. It connected through Atlanta. I worried that I'd be stranded there if the flight was unable to land at the airport in San Juan. It would take nothing short of a small miracle to make it back home. I thought of all the logistics, worried there'd be no cars left in the rental, so I planned to walk if I couldn't get a rental car. I was determined to return home because that's desperation, that I'd walk 30 miles even knowing there was a curfew in place. I knew the paths to take and the roads to avoid, at least I thought I did, and I wouldn't stop or sleep. I felt determined and noble. In short, I was stupid. The worry about supplies crept over me as I flew towards Atlanta, about the quantity of water my mom and brother kept, the food. I packed empty bottles of water I intended to fill in Atlanta, a loaf of bread, granola bars, and candy that you'd think I was headed camping or something like that. So I packed spare batteries, a couple of flashlights, and a few sets of light clothes to change into. I took out a few $100s I wanted to give to my mom, so there would be no access to forms of electronic payments. I didn't carry expectations other than the fear and guilt. As I waited to board my connecting flight in Atlanta, the gate was swarmed with people like me, all desperate for action. I saw us there, packs of ghosts on a plane headed towards uncertainty. Atlanta Hartfield ran its operations like it always did, unaware that the lights went out on an island thousands of miles away, indifferent to the millions of people left stranded. All of it echoed Katrina. The same aftermath, the same indifference, whether by governors or a president that seemed to revel in using our grief as a prop. Of course, the irony of being Puerto Rican and living on the islands is this: Puerto Ricans on the island cannot vote for the presidency of the United States. All 3 million of us, U.S. citizens, incapable of voicing their anger. 3.2 million citizens left in the dark, abandoned after Maria's wake. I wasn't sure what I'd come across when we landed. Most of us weren't. I kept telling myself that it was an overreaction, that jumping into doomsday mode was an exaggeration. But when the silence grew, I think what I wanted was to have agency and to act. When we finally landed, we were met with a heavy heat and swarms of people, mostly tourists, trying to escape. And here we were, those desperate and foolish daughters and sons needing to return home. The Avis attached to the main airport terminal was barely functioning. Everything at the airport was living off generators that would go out sporadically. I managed a cheap Hyundai and I drove out, desperate to see. The landscape, it was stripped, a sky overcast in high noon, a haze of dust that seemed to have camped over the mountains for days, and a smell of garbage that drenched and displaced seeped through the air, like standing water in a dumpster that's baked over days. There weren't any cars driving down the stretch of expressway past Rio Hondo, past El Paseo de Indio Bridge. The mountains looked like dead corals, their rock-faced exposed. The guilt had faded into sadness. Seeing all the dead landscape filled me. I kept hoping not to see the trees fallen in my mom's front yard. I thought about the utility post that stood too close to the front of my house. Had it fallen onto the roof? I pulled into the driveway and pressed the brakes because I needed to take it in. Everything that I grew up with had been uprooted and I felt guilty for not being there, for leaving. Somehow, I thought perhaps I could have stopped it, helped tie the trees down to the ground, or prayed with my mom the way she often did every morning. Little things I knew wouldn't have made a difference, but in that moment, it was all I could think about. When I knocked on the door, I heard my mom stumble to her feet, and she kept repeating, "It better not be who I think it is, it better not be." And she shook the lock open and grabbed me, and she started crying as we hugged. Her face was red, her hair smelled, and there was a dampness that came through the door. My brother, because he often handled me in a sort of way, laughed, and as I entered and looked around, he shook his head with a sharp smirk. After some time settled, seeing the yard scrapped for parts, every tree snapped or uprooted, my brother sat and couldn't stop laughing to himself. And he said, You should have turned that hero music off in your head. I saw the rations of water, saw how they collected barrels of it outside to flush the toilets, and thought about how many times I'd have to flush whenever I used. Thought about the bread I brought with me. At night when I was hungry, that's what I ate, washing it down with the water that I brought. I didn't want to waste their rations, and why was I there? What was I hoping to accomplish? Growing up in the 90s in Puerto Rico was like watching a balloon inflate. The promise of jobs, the housing market and growth. The governor at the time, Pedro Rosselló, along with other political figures and leaders, were part of blowing air into that balloon. And of course, it would soon burst. And many of us would be scattered across the US as a result. After the market crash of '08, the economic situation on the island grew dire. Many of us that were born and raised there with parents that held some economic means ended up leaving. An entire generation of Puerto Ricans moving to the United States in order to improve or sustain their station. It wasn't the first time I felt guilt for leaving. My parents came out of poverty, and like many from that generation, believed education was the only answer to accessing a better life. So since I could remember, they preached college, but to be specific, it was always college in the US, even though neither of them really knew what that meant. It was a vicarious dream of theirs they wanted for me and my brothers to have, no matter the debt and no matter the death. I left home. The first time leaving was to study in the state of Iowa, of all places. I was still 17, entering what seemed like a foreign planet. That's the plains. The politics, the unspoken rules, the terribly unflavored food, the suffocating flatness of the plains. That fall at Iowa State, I saw snow and I felt cold. The first snow of that season came in just as I turned 18. And a few days after that, after my birthday, it became a constant feeling, the numbing of the skin against the frigid winters, the growing gloom of consistent overcast afternoons, just like we're about to experience, I'm sure, in a week and a half. And during my time in Iowa, during those 4 years in college, my family suffered many deaths. It underscored my guilt. I experienced every single one of those family deaths from a distance, from my chosen leaving, my position in the diaspora, and it built up my guilt. And eventually, that became the destined reason for me to return home. I always knew that I would leave again, return home to inevitably leave again. The feeling remains to this day that I left and I chose to leave. Chris Abani's essay, quote, "Painting a Body of Loss and Love in the Proximity of an Aesthetic," published in the Millions, interrogates the role art plays in dealing with grief and the role artists have in bearing witness, the responsibility of the artist, if you will. It is an essay that I teach often, and maybe I return to it as a pedagogical tool to help students see their own work and that of wielding responsibility. Maybe I teach it to remind myself of my own role, or perhaps my own limitations. Sitting there, in candlelight and kerosene lamps, I watched as my mom moved back and forth on her rocking chair, listening to the transistor radio and hearing Luis Ojeda tell us the state of things. She interrupts my thought by asking if it's bad out there, if the news is reporting the aftermath stateside in the same graphic way. I say something along the lines of commentary, right, of surveying to her everything that she can't possibly see, her and my brother hold up in our home. I tell her of the pictures circulating on CBS and NBC, horses dead atop roofs, people desperate and pleading, some treading through dirty and dangerous water looking to escape. Entire barrios underwater in Toa Baja, houses stripped of roofs and walls, that the mountain towns specifically were the most abandoned. I let slip out a, "You were lucky." It embarrassed me how quickly I went into commodifying pain and experience. She sighed. My mom sighed. I expected her to respond with something, anything to give me a perspective I could keep with me as witness. But she didn't say much. She closed her eyes and listened to Ojeda continue his rambling. The next day at 5 a.m., I went with her to try and get gasoline for her car. We drove to the gas station near the bend of our house. We waited for what must have been 4 hours. She'd hold my hand from time to time, then let out a brief smile before returning to the wait. After some time, we saw someone that must have worked at the gas station walking and telling all the parked cars that there was no gas coming. My mother didn't say much. We left. Days passed, and each day left much time to think and reflect. As I worked with my brother to clear the debris, hacking into the fallen trees, trying to organize the mess, hoping someone from the government would come help clean all the garbage, days passed, and the stock of food at my mom's house started concerning me. My mom and I decided to venture out to Bayamon to try to get into Costco. My brother stayed behind, chopping into the logs and helping with the cleaning. When we approached the Costco, there were so many cars and people clogging La Número Dos, which is the main road that crosses in front of it. So many people seated atop their cars, some hanging out their windows, the horns sounding and yelling, and frustration growing and growing. I looked to my mother, and again, she didn't say much. She let out a defiant, "Let's go back home." And so we left. I made a promise to my wife to visit her family before leaving the island. The only way of communicating with anyone through technology was the off chance of finding signal in scattershot places. In those moments, I was able to connect back to Nebraska to her so she could book my return home, another home. I had only requested 10 days from my colleagues to cover the classes. I was teaching that fall. I needed to return. Before leaving my house, I opened my wallet and gave my mom all the cash I brought with me, and it was all I thought to bring and all I could afford living off a grad student stipend. I felt stupid for not bringing more. She was running low on cash, and none of the ATMs worked. She refused at first, but as she hesitated, I insisted, and she gave in because she knew. My in-laws, they live in the town of Trujillo Alto in El Barrio Carraízo. The road up the mountain was virtually impassable, but when I arrived, half the concrete fence that wrapped around their house was blown out and a makeshift chain link fence was set up to keep their dog from running out onto the road. It reminded me of the art movement on the islands, a sort of arte de bregar aesthetic, the do-it-yourself mentality that often informs how we engage with resources and living back home. The scholar and emeritus professor from Princeton, Arcadio Díaz Quiñones, expands on this ideology in his book, El arte de bregar. He states that, quote, "Entre puertorriqueños, hablar de bregar es hablar de lo más obvio. Tal vez no haya palabra más decisiva para reconocer y reconocerse, y para diferenciar un valor distintivo de la subjetividad colectiva, así como los esplendores y las miserias que la movilizan." And the English translation is my translation. I saw around me that aftermath, the new normal everyone was now experiencing, makeshift solutions to address an abandonment. Some may call that resolve, though I'm wary about a term that tends to absolve responsibility. The last days in Puerto Rico I spent with my in-laws and their family. We drive to the top of the mountain because that is where the phone signal again was faint, but it sometimes came through. From there, you could see the bones of the mountains, the wiring of nature displayed, if you will. And off looking toward the ocean and horizon, the cement and quietness of San Juan was dead of activity. Those sights, they remain etched within all of us, the way certain remembrances offer consolation, evidence of that collective pain. Nowadays, I think about home often. I dream about the screams that must have sounded the night Maria declared her aftermath. I dream that I am home and felt the concrete shake, how all the houses on our islands trembled under the weight of pressure and wind, how lucky we were for surviving and not suffering more than others we knew and read about online or in the papers. I dream about how difficult it is to be away, but more so, I think about what my brother said. You should have turned that hero music off in your head. And whenever I think of home, I know everything is scored in that aftermath, after Maria. My nostalgia is never met with longing for a past that is gone, but more so a guilt that we all feel when we're far away from our people. They remained, and no matter how many dreams I exercise from that memory, it is layered in the guilt of leaving. I wanted to return home, but I left. M. Narcissa Phillips states in her book, A Genealogy of Resistance, that, quote, "The polyvocular, the multiplicity of voices, That is the New World. And it was a new world in a time so new for Africans who were brought here forcibly, here, first the Caribbean, then the Americas, site of massive, traumatic, and often fatal interruptions for Aboriginal peoples, for the Africans, the Asian, and even the European. To, quote, write about what happened in a logical, linear way is to do a second violence. To experience the memory, the remembering, hence the work becomes unreadable in the traditional way, but truer to its origin, less universal and therefore more particular. But the potential for the universal, if there is such a thing, is to be found only in the particular. This concept is important when thinking about how to employ speculation for a country that is and has been for more than half a century in perpetual limbo. And it is my impetus that fuels my work. How collective memory is negotiated after trauma, after natural disaster. How we must learn to speculate a future for home in our shared aftermath. My novel, Velorio, recently published, attempts this multiplicity. I used the framework of Lord of the Flies to imagine how a society after a natural disaster must contend with abandonment, and what would the subjects of that violence be left with. This is where memoria, or memory, manifested. The novel is told from 6 different protagonists that converge in a mountain town and establish a new society called Memoria. People have asked me lately about the violence and the graphic depictions found in the book. I tend to define my work as Caribbean Gothic due to the way violence, trauma, and bodies and characters engage with their natural world. Much of what occurs in the aftermath is part and parcel the product of American jingoism against Puerto Rico, something that is predicated on the notion of American exceptionalism, an affliction not exclusive to Puerto Rico, as many foreign countries have been subject to this specific American violence. In order to explore the Caribbean Gothic, this often means employing the illogical, the supernatural, the nonlinear, but more importantly, as Toni Morrison executes in Beloved, rememory. Quote, rememory as in recollecting and remembering, as in reassembling the members of the body, the family, the population of the past, end quote. And this other sort of broad paraphrase of her, which has been attributed to her, essentially, where history becomes people with names. For those that have read the novel, that is what Damaris transcribes in the notebook she is given. Then she carries with her until the end. The names of history, their stories. Collective memory in the face of natural disaster is what I attempt to define and redefine in the novel, a period in which the characters negotiate between what is real, how they transform their reality, and how they envision an ideal. In this imagining, this speculating, we are revising a story. We are exploring the possibilities, even if some of those very possibilities are tragic, dangerous, and disquieting. But in Velorio, the beauty that is afforded to some of the characters is found in the protagonist, Camila. Her power and agency are demonstrated with a simple act of destruction, the act of tearing down the old world and ways of oppressing. It is how she learns to accept death and how to tell Marisol's story, her sister, to begin anew. When I teach writing to students here at Notre Dame, it always strikes me as essential, the desire to tell stories, whether through language, visual art, music, all of it converging in what we call the liberal arts. Our students are captured in a world of extreme commerce and capitalism, a desire to earn in excess because growing up, that is what they're told matters. Notre Dame, as an institution, is unique in its call to service. It's called to help and heal the world with a hope of leaving it more beautiful than how they found it. But the truth is, what matters often to them, my students, is a desire to be heard, to build, at least when enrolled in my class, narratives that represent some facet of their being, to use language and push it to ask questions that matter to them and in turn become urgent points of inquiry for our collective futures. In a time where futures seem bleak, the ever-present threat of violence and war tries to distract us, tries to slant our collective story towards something stark and powerless. But I seek comfort in language language and the power of stories. I tell my students that are so preoccupied with anxiety and fear and distress that we are capable of so much. That to take, for example, a class in creative writing is not some dispensable nor arbitrary checklist to fulfill a college experience. The humanities do not encompass a dying or archaic understanding of what we are as a people, but our ability to realize that our own humanity by way of what we present to others. Our ability to empower through language and the creation of stories is an urgent discipline. And as, again, Toni Morrison, I'm a big fan, states in her essay, War Talk, quote, "The power of this alternate language does not arise from the tiresome, wasteful art of war, but rather from the demanding, brilliant art of peace," end quote. I leave you today with a poem that brings me comfort in times of distress. And it is by Lucille Clifton, "The Garden of Delight." For some, it is stone, bare, smooth as a buttock's rounding into the crevice of the world. For some, it is extravagant water, mouths wide open, washing together forever. For some, it is fire, for some, air. And for some, certain only of the syllables, it is the element they search their lives for, Eden. For them, it is a test. Thank you.
Do we have time for some questions, Becky?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Professor Aquino, will you answer some questions?
Sure, we have time now.
Maybe I'll just get things started while people reflect. First, thank you so much for this presentation. It was really, really quite compelling. I have heard parts of it before, but not all of it put together quite in this manner, and I just found it really moving and compelling, and I really appreciate that. Lots of it struck me, and I won't ask you about all of it, but the, as a literary critic, the term Caribbean Gothic I thought was really compelling and interesting. Is that your invention? Is that your crafting? And in a broader kind of literary sense, to what is it in reference to? In addition to Velorio, what does it kind of give us a window onto?
Yeah, no, that's an important question. I didn't come up with the term. I wish I had. It would probably make me more prestigious in different ways. Caribbean Gothic was a term that was afforded to me by my outside reader during my dissertation at the University of Nebraska, a fellow Puerto Rican that works in modern languages. We would meet from time to time because he was the outside reader for my dissertation. And he mentioned and made note that you know that you're writing within a specific tradition in the Caribbean, at the very least within the Hispanophone Caribbean, that tends to address bodies, language, and violence in an interesting structure that moves towards elements of supernatural possibilities and how violence is then articulated and in some ways performed within that region. Writers in Puerto Rico, specifically Marta Aponte, does this in some of her work. She's very, I guess, experimental and uses form specifically to redress some of these ideas of what the Gothic can mean in the Caribbean context. But broadly speaking, no, I wish I had termed it. But it's a curious way of looking at the impact that violence has in the region, right? The impact, and it's not just specific to the Caribbean, right? We're thinking Latin America. And it's always curious to me in thinking through the ways in which the portrayal of violence and the portrayal of sort of graphic depictions are not that they're welcomed, but that they're accepted as part of the conversation, the overarching conversation of colonialism and or post-colonialism in a lot of states. In relationship to Latin America specifically, that Latin American authors, Caribbean writers, etc., they do not a bad word, they do not fear using violence as a vehicle to better understanding the colonial subject or the post-colonial subject. So that's how I kind of envision it and how I weave myself in that tradition. Of course, the Anglophone Caribbean and the Francophone Caribbean also engage with elements of violence and or this idea of Caribbean Gothic. But no, it's unfortunately not a term. But maybe it is a term that I invented and nobody has told me, or that he invented. I don't know, the scholars can pick me apart in that way, but there is a long history of it that I was grateful to be made aware of earlier on before I even set out to write this book, right? There were different ways in which I thought of violence and used violence in short stories and things like that, and it was always interesting to see how people received my stories in the capacity of workshops or readers, and that it wasn't a point of contention depending on the reader or where the reader came from. In the United States, it's interesting to see the reception that Velorio has gotten for some readers, whether it's broadly speaking or specific to a certain demographic, versus what some Latin American people who have read the book have come to me and have spoken more specifically about it, since it was also translated in Spanish and it was released at the same time with the English version. So I was able to sort of see in a peculiar way the different receptions of the book in two different capacities. Yeah, thank you, Mark.
Other questions?
What have the different receptions been? I mean, when you, Latin American, colonial American, I mean, it sounds like Latin American writers use violence as almost a spice or a flavor in writing, as opposed to, it's not shock value.
Yeah, yes, it's not seen as sort of a term of shock value, which is curious for me in the reception of perhaps some demographics and audiences in the English version. I don't know. I think the reception is still left to be determined. The book came out in January, so if you sort of function through traditional larger publishing, you tend to have the privilege of seeing your book live two lives. The hardcover edition and the paperback version, which gets released usually within a window of a year or so after the book is released. So I would say, based on just a broad surveying of reception, which I try not to do, I mean, one of the things that I learned very fast was that I needed to just walk away from reading feedback that either I was looking for myself online or things like that. It's very unhealthy. It's a very unhealthy practice. Never Google yourself if you have any form of art out in the world or anything that is public. So I had like a small period of investigating that initially when the book released, but then after a while I really didn't feel that it was contributing to a sound mind. So I just walked away from all of that. But I've greatly enjoyed the feedback that I've received from scholars that I've been able to meet in different capacities, whether at conferences or readings, that teach at institutions across the United States. For example, during my postdoc, I met a Puerto Rican scholar through Zoom. This was during the pandemic. And I did not know, but he taught the book at Dartmouth, and I've also heard from different scholars that have also taught it either here at the University of Notre Dame, but at UT Austin, back home in Puerto Rico as well, from old mentors or people who have engaged with the book. Scholars tend to be very excited about analyzing it, right? Scholars love this idea of seeing a book that is trying different forms and experimenting with what it means to be, what it means to create narratives, especially published in larger platforms. So they've been very kind in conversation, but also in just how they've seen students really wrestle with the fact that the novel is not concerned with giving this clean portrayal of the experience of the aftermath of the hurricane. But more explicitly, that it is a novel and it's fiction. I think one of the things that maybe, if I look back and I think about it, that it wasn't made clear perhaps in the campaign of pushing the book, that this is not a realism novel that reflects realism. In fact, Florencia, the town that a lot of the characters hail from, does not exist. I thought that would have been the first clue. And then and some people took it verbatim, that some of these representations of towns or what have you, or people, they were like, well, this didn't happen. Well, of course it didn't happen. It's made up. But I'd like to hope, and I'd like to think that the sentiment is an accurate representation of the complexity of that experience, the complexity of feeling both anger, grief, a sense for action, a call to action, but also reimagining what would happen if there was a void of power, a power struggle, if you will, in an environment that a natural disaster would then promote, to take away sort of our system of governing, and then who would then be desiring to fill that void? I don't think it's that peculiar to see our own country, or obviously the United States within this context. The antagonist, if you will, of the book, Urayuan, is a complicated figure because he is a colonial subject, right? But he is very much inspired or I've thought through sort of obviously sort of a megalomaniac figure, an authoritative figure, that authorian figure that wants to sort of micromanage and feed his own ego. So there was that element too. Of course, that I'm not going to hide and behind the reality that the political discourse, since I was living here, reflected that sort of seeping into Urayuan as the idea of an antagonist. But I think to sort of be more brief about it, I've enjoyed the complicated reception that the book has received in the different demographics that people have been able to read it from. And it's always fascinating to me to see that someone in South America read the book and has found me in some capacity and wanted to just send me a note or something like that. That's been interesting and weird to see that the book has traveled in some spaces like that. But I'm always happy to see that at the very least people are frustrated with the book. I think that that's a reward in and of itself. I don't think the book wants to be something that you read and enjoy in that way, but rather that it's a product of what I hope, a complicated conversation on what it means to be Puerto Rican in 2020 something or beyond, right? Thank you.
You spoke about the idea of guilt and how you felt guilty for not having been there when Maria hit, and also for leaving. And I know it's a feeling that's very familiar for most Caribbeans living in the diaspora. I'm wondering, how do you when you're writing stories of home, how do you compromise with guilt and not let it sit through your writing and create this idea of like unrealistic portrayal of your characters as people whose voices you're trying to bring to life?
In thinking about processing, whether it's guilt or a sense of nostalgia. Nostalgia is more of a complicated word because I think nostalgia brings to it a coloring of experience that romanticizes to some capacity what we may have left behind, right? But growing up, I was in a weird in-betweenness back home. And that in-betweenness came from the fact that my mother's a teacher, a middle school teacher, but she works for the federal government, the United States federal government on the military base in Bayamon, Fort Buchanan. And so even though I learned Spanish as my first language, English was sort of the predominant mode of instruction. And so that kind of pushed away some of my command for Spanish in an interesting way. But I always found myself a little bit also outside of it because it's a bubble. It's a military base, therefore there's a control of access and a control of isolation in some ways. So it was very interesting to me to experience that growing up, sort of being Puerto Rican on the island, but also being insulated even in and of itself on a military base. And so that experience of feeling a little bit in between allowed for me to experience home in the complexity that home should be, right? That it is a complicated relationship with home for me, that I can love it and at the same time feel a necessity to critique it, a necessity to explore it and complicate my representations of it in my stories, that I'm not interested in sort of feeding into the performance of nostalgia, right? The performance of of creating these depictions of Puerto Ricans that abroad speaking, even Puerto Ricans, can digest and feel happy about seeing themselves represented in that way. I'm interested in complicating that expectation. And so with guilt, the guilt I think is a personal guilt, and I try very, very hard not to let that carry over in the work. Mostly I anchor my process with voice. I still haven't been able to write an effective story or novel or anything like a third person, which is an interesting perspective to explore. So with first person, I love voice. I love playing with what voice can do, the rhythms on the page, of course, musicality, what have you. But it's not something that I dwell on too much. There are times, right? Sometimes that it'll seep through. But overall, my experience and my desire for home is about complicating the situation, thinking of us as people, as human beings. Toni Morrison got a lot of that when she started publishing, right? There was a large section of the Black community, specifically Black writers and scholars, male Black writers and scholars, that were unhappy with her portrayal of Black men in her novels. She didn't care. She wanted to represent and depict a formulation of the experience of being a Black woman in the United States in all its capacity. And that included some unfavorable depictions of Black men. And similarly, I think I embrace that possibility because I think that creates a movement away from trivializing that experience and reducing it to just these performances of perfection, that we are all imperfect, and that in that imperfection, we're going to explore what it means to be a better person if that's a concern for the writer. So that's how I negotiate that. But it ebbs and flows. I mean, there are better days, there are better months, there are better years. The longer that you spend away from home, the more that becomes a reality, right? That you're just ebbing and flowing between highs and lows of that distance. And then if you're a creator, you're sort of investigating that distance in different ways. So I assume it's different for everyone, but for me, it's always been trying my best to compartmentalize things such as guilt and moving them aside to work with what I have in front of me on the page. Thank you. Yeah.
So I know the rebuilding the island continues even today. Just curious how your family and your wife's family doing?
They're doing fine. I mean, as fine as you can with an unstable power grid, right? It's not, this conversation of resources and electricity and things of that nature are always striking to me because growing up, that was a common occurrence, that the fragility of our power grid, as an example, right, as a necessity, was beyond outdated, and that there weren't any motives or implications of how to improve that during my time growing up there. And so when I hear and I see and I read and I return home and every once in a while you'll have a power outage, I never found that as peculiar or strange. However, it's become a constant occurrence now through the privatization of LUMA within that specific branch of resources from the government. So we are now currently thinking about what that means, right? We're thinking about taxes or the lack of taxes for certain individuals that are wealthy from abroad that want to come in and sort of privatize beaches and all those other things. And so that to me is always concerning. And thinking, of course, when I started the presentation, what it means to have a home and then have that home be bought and sold, and then the people that you now see around you are not the people you grew up with, et cetera, because a lot of us have either moved to different spaces or have moved beyond. But for the most part, everyone is well, and that's the most important thing. But it's a work in progress. It's like all things when it comes to trying to rebuild or reimagine. How to rebuild, it's a continuous effort. I would venture to guess that even after, for example, 1989 Hurricane Hugo that hit Puerto Rico pretty bad, and it was the last memory I had of sort of recovering after a natural disaster. It took about 10 to 15 years for people to see that sort of in the rearview mirror, see Hugo as like, okay, we're no longer moving into rebuilding after that hurricane. And so I would suspect that, given how Maria impacted the island, that it's going to be significantly longer to even imagine how do we move forward after the storm. And with all things like the climate crisis, it's not going to improve. The frequency of storms and whatnot are going to increase because of the warming of the oceans. So we have to start thinking about more productive ways of rebuilding, or ways of expanding the research that goes into alternative sources and energy and whatnot. So, but everyone is rebuilding and well. So thank you.
Other questions? Professor Aquino, do you have any final comments, anything that you wish we had asked you when we didn't?
No, I mean, I always like to include poetry in any conversation, and that's why I always like to either end, start, or think about poetics within the construct of rhetoric and stuff. So Lucille Clifton, if you don't know her work, she's long passed, but her work is out there for you to read. So I leave you with that, and we can all depart. Thank you, Mark.
Well, please join me in thank you, Professor Aquino.